fide, sola gratia, if Jordan, I think I gave that one to Jordan, right? If Jordan could share his
Yeah.
thoughts, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Oh man, I had all these quotes ready for sola fide, but gave that one to someone else. So, um, yeah, so sola gratia. So, one of the main principles of the Reformation being that salvation is by grace alone, what we generally refer to as a monergistic approach to salvation, that there is a sole worker of salvation that is God. So when we're talking about sola gratia, we're really, and you see this, in Luther and in Calvin. So both Lutheran and Reformed traditions are very much going to ground themselves in Saint Augustine's theology of grace. So when we're using the sola gratia principle, we're very much connecting ourselves to the Augustinian tradition. Now, I know there's a whole line of criticism that says that Augustine kind of created this whole salvation by grace alone thing, and especially from Eastern Orthodox critics, that the church before that didn't deal with these issues. But I think with what Dr. Ortland said already is it's not really until these issues come to a point of debate that they get defined. That's just the way theology works in history. That's the way that it always is. So, if you look at Justin Martyr's Trinitarian theology, it wouldn't be considered orthodox if you're looking, post-Nicaea. Not because Justin wasn't orthodox, but because they didn't hash out some of the particulars yet, and he wasn't thinking about those things. So when you're looking at the pre-Augustinian church, sometimes they are dealing with the kind of fatalism that you find in certain strains of Gnosticism. So they do talk a bit about free will. But it's not really until Pelagius that you have the conversations now beginning about exactly how free will and grace relate to one another. So it's in light of the work of Pelagius that Augustine then makes his response, that you then have the development of the Augustinian tradition. But I would say, read any of Augustine's anti-Pelagian writings, very, very clear testimony, I think, to grace alone. And on those points, there are still Roman Catholic apologists I encounter every once in a while who try to make Augustine synergistic on conversion, and I just think you can't do it in Augustine, not in his later writings. But the thing is, it's not just Augustine. He's not just this isolated figure. You get an entire tradition of Augustinian theology that extends from Augustine. So you get a guy named Fulgentius of Rus, who is sometimes called the Second Augustine. And in Fulgentius, also in North Africa, writes a number of treatises dealing with the issues of grace and is continuing to explain the same theology that Augustine has. Then you get St. Prosper of Aquitaine, who is another figure. He's a secretary to Pope Leo. And in Prosper of Aquitaine, he's not clergy as far as we know. He's a layperson, but he writes a number of treatises that are collected in a couple different volumes in English. One is called In Defense of Augustine, which is a series of his treatises, and the other is called A Call of All Nations. But he writes against what later becomes known as semi-Pelagianism. And he's essentially arguing against those who would argue that conversion is this process of human free will working together with God's grace. Oftentimes, human free will kind of taking the first step, and then grace takes the second step and kind of takes over. So Prosper identifies this as a kind of modified Pelagianism. And what's so interesting about reading St. Prosper is when you read his early writings, you hear the phrase like cage stage Calvinist. I mean, he fits that to a T. Like, he is ready to tear everybody apart who does not agree with him exactly on all of these issues. It's kind of funny. And then you see when he writes his later writings, like The Call of All Nations, he's actually calmed down a little bit in his rhetoric, and he actually comes to probably a more moderate form of Augustinianism. But then from there, you have someone like Caesarius of Arles, who becomes the chief theologian at the Council of Orange in 529, which makes some actual official decisions, at least for the Western part of the church. It's not an ecumenical council. But you do have bishops of Rome, so you have popes promoting the Council of Orange. So the Council of Orange actually comes to the conclusion that semi-Pelagianism is wrong, not just the strict Pelagian position that was rejected at Ephesus and other councils. So from that point forward, you have actually throughout the Middle Ages a number of debates about predestination, the extent of grace, how grace works together with free will. In the 9th century, a guy named Gottschalk of Orbeis, Thomas Gottschalk, who defends a double predestination and a limited atonement. He ends up getting imprisoned for his views. It's a really wild story. But in the midst of that, the emperor, who's Charles the Bold at the time, calls a number of theologians to like comment on this and what's going on. So you have a number of different perspectives that then show up. So once you get to the Reformation and you're looking at the monergistic perspectives, on the one hand, you have the Calvinistic one, which is a double predestinarian, limited atonement perspective. But then you have the more moderate Augustinian perspective, which is still monergistic, but a universal atonement. That's what you find in the Lutheran Reformation. Both of those traditions really do extend back as interpretations of the Augustinian tradition. I mean, going all the way back, say, Prosper of Aquitaine's own writings. His earlier writings, he's double predestinarian. His later writings, he's not. So I'd say there are these kind of streams of thought that have really been there since these issues were discussed. So I think there's no question that Sola Gratia is certainly no kind of theological novum, but this is a doctrine that's been debated and discussed as long as people have been talking about theology.